Welcome back to BSA by Design, a podcast about transforming healthcare, educational, and research facilities through expert design and insight. I'm your host, Brian Moore. Thanks again for joining us. In this episode, I'm joined by Josh Vell, Scott Allen, and Emmie Tyson for discussion about designing and planning for student life on college campuses. We talk about creating communal spaces, what to consider when designing residence halls and on-campus housing, promoting wellness, sustainability, flexibility, and adaptability, as well as creating spaces for engagement and activity. But first, let me introduce our guest on this episode. Josh Vell is the Director of Design at BSA and graduated from the University of Utah with a BS in Architectural Studies and a Master of Architecture. Prior to BSA, he worked as the Higher Education Practice Director for Perkins & Will. He joined BSA in 2018 as a Regional Director and then became Director of Learning and Student Life Practice Director. Since June of 2020, he has been BSA's Director of Design. Scott Allen is an architect and the Learning and Discovery Practice Director at BSA. He earned his bachelor's degree in architecture from Virginia Tech. Prior to joining BSA, Scott worked for Perkins & Will, Fentress Architects, the Beck Group, EYP, and most recently, Senior Project Director at Page. And finally, Emmie Tyson is a senior architect and the architectural lead at BSA's Raleigh studio. Emmie graduated from North Carolina State University with a Bachelor of Architecture degree and a Bachelor of Environmental Design in Architecture. She is AIA certified and a member of the AIA Board of Directors for the AIA Triangle Chapter. Emmie has been with BSA since 2016. And now, on to our conversation.
Well, thanks for joining us, all three of you. Josh, why don't I start with you? How do you balance functional requirements with creating an engaging and inspiring environment when designing student unions, recreation centers, and other student life facilities?
Well, I think, when you're talking about facilities that are sort of built around the student experience, that sort of is the functional requirement, if that makes any sense. If it's not engaging, it's not doing its job. And that's the primary function of a lot of those things. It's about putting things in place that bring students together. It brings them together around, kind of shared interests, shared purpose, all that good stuff. Then there's the typical, like XYZ has to be XY big. And, there's a little bit of a balancing act. And a lot of it comes from, really talking to the students so that you understand what the highest priority is in terms of what they're hoping to get out of it.
Do you ever have any takeaway when you're talking to students like that? Do you ever have any epiphany, like, I hadn't thought of that before?
Here and there, yeah. Students, by and large, sort of live in a spectrum that's not terribly different from institution to institution. There's unique qualities and nuances, from place to place for sure. And they kind of, they migrate around certain ideas. Once in a while, you'll get, to a place where they just literally haven't had what they've needed for so long that you kind of take a step back and say, wow, this is something that's really been missing from their campus experience. It used to be that students would, enroll in college and they may live on campus, they may not. They have classes, for mathematics over on this corner of the campus, and they'd have, English lit over here, and they just kind of move from place to place. And then when they needed help with their advising, they'd go to a different building for that. Then they'd go someplace else to have lunch. And I think the movement has been sort of building the daily experience around what the student needs. So, it's become more of a task in trying to create these engaging environments that do 10 things instead of 2 things, if that makes sense.
Well, Scott, for you, similar kind of thought, but let's talk about residence halls. So what are some key considerations when designing residence halls and some of the on-campus housing to meet the evolving needs and expectations of today's college students?
Yeah, very similar to what Josh said. It's about trying to have all these integrated needs. We look at residence halls and, they're no longer places where you just live, right? They're places that have multiple uses. We look at ideas of live, work, play. So students do as much kind of sometimes learning there. There's spaces in there for learning. There's spaces in there where they have eating opportunities at the base of their residence halls. It's a space for community to be developed. It's always been a space for that, but the community has many different aspects now. It's for study, it's for wellness, it's for, just being a part of the school itself And it's not just a place where you sit and live in your community and go to bed at night or study in your room in private. It's really about being active and being in that group.
That ties in really well with what Josh was just saying, because I do remember my college experience of like, here's where you're at, and to get to where you're going to eat is way over here, and then your classes are in the opposite direction. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's good for the step counter on your smartwatch, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I have had students say, "Can you put in more stairs? We want to get more steps in a day." Which, like we're all about stair culture and things like that, for sure.
Emmie, what are some of the unique challenges in designing these facilities for specific student populations? So I'm thinking first year students, grad students possibly with some disabilities.
So I think one of the unique challenges is making everyone feel welcome and creating equity in our design. Student success is really no longer just about graduation rates, but students really want a place that they feel like they can belong and a sense of community on campus. So this includes all types of students. So our designs should be open and inviting and welcoming. We should have intuitive wayfinding, transparency, and particularly ease of access. So solving these challenges really begins at the very onset of the project when we're setting goals with the client and the initial planning of the building.
Josh, what role does flexibility, adaptability play in your design approach for these types of multi-purpose facilities that serve such a diverse group of students' needs?
There's a lot to unpack in that one. Flexibility has a lot of different levels. I mean, most of these facilities have a cadence throughout the day and the week that requires them to be different things based on, who's using it at a particular time, or, what the size of the group is and what activities they want to engage in. So, there's that level. So you kind of have to think about it like, how can this thing do a couple of different things during the day? Then there's the level of, we know things aren't going to be the same tomorrow, and there's going to be, a need for some more significant changes. So you try to make sure that you're not planning in a lot of barriers to modification. So, the way we think about our structural systems and our mechanical integrations becomes really important from that perspective. Making sure that circulation, corridors and such, which doesn't sound like the most exciting thing in the world, is ample, so that, you can kind of deal with the crush of people coming into a space for a particular activity. I mean, I think about like summer conferencing as a perfect example. So res halls, student centers, rec centers, you name it. When they're not fully engaged with, a full-time student population during the normal school year, whether that's, fall and spring semester, or if you're on quarters, whatever it is, there's always this period in the summer where, young students who are kind of thinking about where to go to college, or they're involved with a certain affinity group, are going to spend a week on campus. And, they'll usually double stack all the res halls to get twice as many students in there. They'll have, this giant crush of very excitable, teenagers making their way to the dining hall. And, since they listen so well all the time, you have to be able to kind of herd them in the right ways. So, there's that kind of flexibility. And then there's the need for the programs that they just don't know if they exist yet. Like I'm thinking about esports as one of those things that kind of snuck up on a lot of folks. And the student unions of the world were sort of the best suited to accommodate like an immediate need. They had larger kind of meeting spaces. They were sort of technology rich in places. It was a place where it was okay if things got a little loud. So they really pivoted some of those spaces to accommodate those things. And now you're seeing like actual facilities being dedicated to that kind of activity. So
that's a really good point. My son, as I think you all know, but just for posterity, I'm saying it out loud, it goes to Butler University, and they just built a building within the last couple of years that is dedicated 100% to esports. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. Like I've never been a stick and ball sports guy. I'd be even worse at video games, So like the actual experience isn't one that I'm familiar with, but I like it. I think it's great.
But if you take into consideration, there's a whole generation behind us that has grown up playing these, games and everything, and they're not, like you said, stick and ball. It is a community in it of itself. So they've got these spaces that they can do that.
It's interesting. I was listening to an article on this little show on NPR called Hidden Brain. They were talking about sort of the psychology of the social media and digital age. And, the number of instances in which younger people are, interacting with each other in the physical world has been reducing. and they've kind of retreated to the safety of the virtual worlds, whether it's a game or whether it's, just a virtual environment where they can meet up. And that's been a little controversial because, whether there are good things about it, which I'm sure there are, there can be some downsides. But having said that, that's been their paradigm since they were, 12, 13, 14 years old. And you got to think about it when you design a building today and go through that process and then construct it and get it built, the incoming freshman class is probably today's 8th graders. So that's where you kind of have to be looking to see, where the hopes, wants, and dreams are going to be.
That's exactly right. I mean, my son is an 8th grader. He took an esports class, and it was really, the teacher started it because he wanted to give them a gateway to not only understand that, but a gateway to computer science. And then they start programming their own games, programming their own worlds, and they're like leaping much beyond where any of us were in high school before they get to college to even think about these things. And it's amazing how their education starts then, and really where it starts about where it's forming what they want to do and how they want to impact the world in that way from that time on.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I was going to pivot to asking you, so we've got these individual identities. So Emmie, how do you approach creating a cohesive campus experience through to the design of some of these student life facilities, while also respecting individual identities of different buildings on campus?
Well, I'm going to channel my inner Josh for a minute. We can take cues from the surrounding buildings, whether it's scale or rhythms and window pattern or materiality. But in some ways, some of these buildings that are hubs for student activity may want to be a beacon on campus and really stand out, whether that you're putting the student activity on display through exterior-interior relationships or transparency. But truly, every campus and student body has its own identity. So we really just need to work hard to design for that group of students in particular.
Sometimes it's as simple as just sort of acknowledging the way students move about a campus. The identity is one thing, and that's, sometimes more consistent from some campuses, compared to others, and others, there's a lot more diversity. But what you do find is that students have something that they've connected with. There's a story about that place that they have connected with. There's, some sense of whether they be traditions or, values that they've put on display. You can kind of connect those dots. And then, if you do that successfully, then the physical expression maybe isn't quite so important in terms of how that is.
Yeah. And every campus is different too, right? I mean, what those things are, that are the beacons and everything.
Yeah. I mean, it's a little different when you're, trying to drop a building on Oxford's campus, probably going to be some limestone and some other stuff like that versus, like Arizona State, which is, a wonderful collection of really exotic, kind of signature buildings by all of the famous names. It's sort of a petting zoo.
I like that.
One of everything.
Scott, how do you approach creating communal spaces and amenities within residence halls that foster a sense of community and belonging among those students?
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting question, right? So when students go to their residence hall, it's usually their first home away from home, and then they want to find a way to belong and have that community. That community can come at a lot of different scales, like we've talked about in these other buildings as well. It can be a small room, right, or nook where it has a view and you can study on your own or study in a small group of a couple people. We can have kitchenettes in those that are ones where students actually prepare meals together. And really have that kind of experience of living together or really wanting to do that. Or it can be focused around wellness, right? And wellness is a big part of what we're seeing be a part of what are now some of the drivers in these new residence halls. And wellness can be anything from spaces for a small gym to a yoga space to a space on the outdoors, right? Again, I think these buildings, how they interact inside out and outside in is really important. For those students and the way that they can socialize, the way that they can interact with each other. And they want to come into a space that they feel safe kind of to grow and walk past, students that they know. And they may not know all of them personally, but they know the community and they feel like they're at home once they walk into that building. And so those are some of the things we look to try to do and create those scales, create those opportunities for that. We found that, the students are most engaged when we create opportunities for them to be able to socialize and to study together and to really have those places of wellness to interact within that same community of the building itself on either the interior or exterior.
Yeah, you'll notice kind of a very pointed view that most directors of residence life will take. And that is, your first experience living away from home should keep you out of your room as much as possible. So you're going to see a lot of, kind of doubles and occasional singles, but quads and things. But, it's got kind of the basics in there. And then they really try hard to push those students out into the common areas where that mixing happens. And the good thing about that is they get, into a situation where they experience things that are not their experience. So there's a challenge there, and that's where growth comes from, right? So
yeah, your best moments usually are never in the room with your roommates, right? It's always out in some common shared space.
Whenever I program,
it's in studio. All of us architecture students had a community space that was ours to live in, and we did.
I mean, every conversation I've started in programming a res hall has usually started with, I've got these brilliant freshmen coming in who are so digitally connected. And if I let them, they will never leave their bedroom and stay plugged in every minute of every day. And, sometimes the coursework is presented that way too, and that doesn't help. So he's like, my job is to make sure that doesn't happen. And in all honesty, that's a predictor of success. So could be the brightest students in the world, but if they don't engage with other human beings, it's not in their favor for getting, having a successful outcome in the higher ed landscape.
I want to stay with you, Josh, for this, because we talked earlier about some of that feedback that you can get during the planning process. Can you share some examples of design solutions that have effectively integrated student input and feedback into planning?
If it was a student life facility that I worked on, then that's one of them, because it always starts with conversations with them. It's really important to have their input and get their engagement. You see it a little less on the academic side. There's a much more sort of purposeful, pointed path towards, we've got to have these things, and it can revolve around accreditation requirements or, what programs are trying to ramp up. But when it comes to the softer side of the student experience, you just literally can't avoid that conversation. So it's usually a number of visioning sessions with students. It's trying to understand, in a more perfect world, what would something look like to best suit your needs? What are the things that you think are an absolute must-have for the project to be a success? And then, many times the students you're talking to, they know that, it's probably going to be closer to the end of their academic career when they get to experience it, if at all. And, I've had several experiences where students have come back and, just because they wanted to see how it turned out. And, that's a wonderful thing. I've seen that at the University of Kentucky. I've seen it at Simon Fraser University. I've seen it at the University of Nebraska in Omaha. It's just the level of commitment that many of these students give to these projects is pretty extraordinary and super valuable. And you would kind of expect that anybody that's willing to participate like that would be, sort of passionate about things beyond, well, I got my diploma and I'm down the road, so to speak.
Scott, in your experience, what are some of the innovative design strategies that have promoted health, wellness, and sustainability in student housing projects?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about those earlier, right? Creating spaces for like gyms and yoga spaces. But, there are really options that are out there on the healthy eating side, too. We're seeing that, a big part of this, if you have a eating space that's a part of it, that there's thoughts that students have maybe even a communal garden that they work on, ones that they can actually choose the food source a little bit about what they want to have there, because it is really a big part of their consciousness, right? I mean, the well-being idea is really about the mind, body, and the soul. And so, they're getting educated. They're really trying to have and learn about how to really kind of persevere, become independent, become social in an adult world. And they're looking for this idea of where spaces that they could have that are quiet, spaces that they can interact. That's why you see these villages. They create these kind of little communities around. They have the in-between spaces between the buildings where they can actually have activities, create their own kind of outdoor kind of events together. Maybe it's a space where they actually can play a sport of some sort, interact, those types of things.
Throw a frisbee,
all those kind of things. So wellness has all kinds of different avenues about this, but it also helps support the community itself. So there is this kind of duality between the idea of the wellness and the community kind of working together hand in hand.
It was a hacky sack back in the 80s in my day.
So, that's right, it was.
And I think we all like that because you really just were standing around. Like you moved a little bit, but you kind of just sort of hang and have a conversation and pretend like you're doing something athletic.
Emmy, I've had Josh and Scott on the podcast earlier, so they've had a chance to answer kind of a future leaning question. So I want to save this one for you for the last. In your opinion, what are some of the emerging trends and innovations in student life facility design that institutions should be considering for the future?
I think there are quite a few, but I can boil it down to 3 or maybe 4. Students really are craving flexibility and personalization. So I think we're seeing more need to design spaces that the students can decide how to use their space. That helps them feel ownership, and they can personalize it based on their mood or their specific needs, kind of back to designing for all different types of students that I was talking about before. But there's also, the students that are the 8th graders that we mentioned that we're designing for today also lived through the pandemic, and that's still something that they can remember. So we've talked a little bit about this, but the renewed focus on connection and community is incredibly important too. So we need to be designing for interaction. And we talked a little bit about esports, and I think there's different types of interaction. There's the students who want to have their headset on and be connected to the community in a public space so they can feel that connection, but they're still in their focused time. Or there's the students who want the collaboration spaces so they can be meeting with others actively and collaborating with their peers. And then I think technology is incredibly important. How we're planning for technology for this tech savvy generation, which is difficult to do. We can't always predict what technology is going to look in 4 years. But this generation has focus on sustainability. They really care about the impact that they're making on the environment and the impact that the environment is making on them as well. So they're particularly interested in their own well-being. So we need to think about that as we're designing these spaces. How are we bringing daylight in? How are we putting stairs on display? Biophilic design and bringing green into the building. So I think they're increasingly aware of their own well-being and how our facilities that we design can impact that.
I love the technology part of it because, back in the 90s, we were putting data ports like every 8 feet on every wall.
Yes, you need this.
And
this is the wave of the future.
We got to have it. And then, a few years later, it's all wireless now.
Yeah.
But you still can't have enough
Yeah, it's very hard to predict where that's going. Well, I really want to thank you guys for joining today and sharing this. I think this is a really good topic. So,
well, thanks for having us.
Yeah. Thank you. It was great.
That was a fun conversation about designing student spaces on campuses, and a lot of great insight there from Scott, Emmy, and Josh. I appreciate them joining me on this episode. If you're interested in learning more about how BSA Life Structures can serve your project needs, we encourage you to visit our website at bsalifestructures.com. There's a link in the show notes to contact us for more information. You can subscribe to BSA by Design wherever you get your podcasts, from Apple, YouTube Music, and Spotify. And we've got new content to share all the time, so be sure to follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and X. That's going to do it for this episode. Join us again next time on BSA by Design.